Hello and welcome to another episode of Foreign Pulse. This is a weekly show where I bring to you prominent international developments from global current affairs and try to bring expert opinion, analysis and understanding of in depth of what is happening around the world, why it's happening, what kind of forces are shaping these developments, and to make sense of the larger picture of these developments. So like every week, I have this week for you three important developments. First, the Indian Prime Minister is in Britain this week, and after a long gap, an Indian Prime Minister is attending the Commonwealth Heads of Government meet. We're going to talk about the importance of the Commonwealth for India in the current context. Then we move to South Asia, where just across our border from Bangladesh, there is a small trickle of Rohingya refugees who are apparently going back or wanting to go back to Myanmar, but face many hurdles. So we're going to talk about this humanitarian crisis right next door. And last but not least, Cuba in Latin America is undergoing a massive transformation, so to say, where the Castros, the brothers who have ruled Cuba for the last 60 years, are giving way to a younger person within the Cuban Communist Party. How big of a change it is and what will it have an impact on Latin America and the world. So these are the three issues. Let's go to that show, but first, before that, I want to introduce to you my friend and colleague, Professor Jessica Field. She is the guest today in our show. She is a historian by training and teaches at the Jindal School of International Affairs. Thank you, Jessica, for joining me. Narendra Modi is in Britain for the second time in just 3 years, and a very significant event is happening, the Commonwealth Summit, which an Indian Prime Minister is attending after nearly a decade. Let's listen to this first and then carry forward the discussion.
On April 18 and 19, Prime Minister Narendra Modi is in Britain for bilateral and multilateral summits. He is the first Indian PM in nearly a decade to attend the Commonwealth Summit in London. With Britain about to exit the European Union, it is highlighting and upgrading the Commonwealth and wants India to play a bigger role in it. Modi is very keen to increase India's prominence in major multilateral forums. Is the Commonwealth just a talking forum or a powerful economic and strategic body? Can the UK remain India's top choice in Europe after Brexit?
So many questions about the Commonwealth and the UK-India relationship today. One thing is for sure, Prime Minister Modi wants to expand India's engagement in multilateral forums. He just finished a Nordic summit with 5 countries of Scandinavia, and now we have 53 members of the Commonwealth in London to meet. There are some important clusters in the Commonwealth that have important geopolitical value for India and economic value. One is the group of Caribbean countries in what we often call the West Indies. Then there is another cluster in the Pacific, and a third one, of course, in Africa. All these were formerly part of the British Empire and therefore have remained part of the Commonwealth. And they are all gathering. Of course, not every country will be sending the Prime Minister or President or Head of State, but we have decided to go. And this was on a special invitation by the British Queen, where she actually sent a personal letter to Mr. Modi inviting him to attend the summit this time. So it looks like the Commonwealth, some people say is just a quaint relic of an old colonial era and really doesn't have the kind of contemporary relevance. But it looks like right now both Britain and India seem to see a need for scaling up and showcasing the real value of the Commonwealth. So are we seeing a revival of the Commonwealth? Because India is saying it's going to increase its commitment, double its contributions, and bring more investments, and also expand trade within the Commonwealth. And there is this whole talk about how the Commonwealth is now going to see a resurgence with India taking a bigger leadership role, and Britain wants that. And in the context of Brexit, it looks like Britain really needs this big platform to project what Theresa May calls a global Britain.
Yes, you're right, Sreeram. I think this is a significant moment actually for the Commonwealth looking forward for both the UK and India for the reasons that you outline. Of course, firstly, thinking from the perspective of the United Kingdom, Brexit, we're in the process of Brexit, and the UK will look towards other non-European partners as potential opportunities for strengthening their global position. But then, of course, India's role within the Commonwealth is quite significant because in this moment it's broadly recognised that the Queen is, of course, the current head of the Commonwealth. This will likely be her last head of government's meeting, not least because she's obviously ageing and finds it increasingly difficult to make international commitments. So there will be discussion over succession, and there's a potential that Modi and India in particular might be able to have a good chance for the leadership hereafter.
Yes, Jess. In fact, you mentioned the leadership issue within the Commonwealth. Traditionally, the ABC countries, as they've been referred to, Australia, Britain and Canada, are the most advanced economies in the Commonwealth and have been shouldering much of the burden. But now India wants to step up, and it sees this as another opportunity to reach out to distant parts of the world through this platform. They do a few things. For example, trainings and capacity building of public servants, of civil society groups, and democracy promotion and value dissemination. So I think it's a misnomer to say that the Commonwealth is just a talking shop. So clearly they have some agenda of activities, and I think India is wanting to infuse some energy and to take it to the next level. And from the British point of view, you are British, clearly having the Commonwealth is going to be very, very advantageous when it comes to, for example, trade ties with certain clusters that I mentioned before, as well as trying to project that Britain has other options. So how is the atmosphere back home in Britain, where people are looking at the Commonwealth? Are they seeing it as something of a bygone, or do people still cling to it as an important element of British diplomacy and foreign policy, especially in the current Brexit environment?
Well, there were mixed discussions about the importance of the Commonwealth as an institution, but I think it's broadly recognised that it will become increasingly important as we move forward with Brexit. And I think, also it's as much as it doesn't come with specific trade privileges, and as much as there isn't necessarily mechanisms for enforcement for poor performance within this Commonwealth network, there is a kind of unique opportunity for these heads of government and for these nations to engage in terms of soft diplomacy and on a range of other topics in a way that currently isn't possible in other forums. So I think there's a sense of curiosity about it in the UK. There's a sense of pride and a sense of optimism about where it's going.
That's great,
forward.
and I think I just want to tell our viewers that in 2017, we Indian bond issuers used the City of London, the financial hub, to raise over 5.3 billion pounds in terms of capital investments, and both the trade and the investment with the UK are looking upwards. And I think that is one of the reasons Prime Minister is going there, and he's going to be engaging both in the Commonwealth and bilaterally on a lot of business related topics. So let's hope for the best possible outcome, and let's keep an eye out for the leadership and what happens after the Queen passes on the baton. Moving on, a tragedy right next door to India. We know about the plight of the Rohingya refugees. There are close to 1 million of them in Bangladesh. The most recent lot was 700,000, and there were 300,000 from an earlier era. So एक बहुत बड़ा मानवीय संकट वहाँ पर हैं, शरणार्थियों की भीड़, लेकिन वापस जाने में बहुत सारी दिक्कतें आ रही हैं. Let's listen into this report first and carry the discussion forward.
On April 14th, Myanmar announced that it received 5 Rohingya refugees back from Bangladesh. Although the UN and international observers say safety, security and property of Rohingyas are not assured in Myanmar, the two governments of Bangladesh and Myanmar have agreed that the repatriation is the only solution. Rohingyas are the most unwanted people in the world. They are caught between the devil and the deep sea. Can there be justice for Rohingyas as long as Myanmar denies them basic rights? Why have Western countries not taken in more Rohingyas refugees?
So, a classic case of injustice and of people who have been abandoned by pretty much all the stakeholders. Now you have a situation where, as I said, 1 million of them are refugees, and hardly anyone is in a position to go back, but Myanmar is advertising that we have started the repatriation. Is repatriation the solution? It seems like a very inhuman solution right now, given that the security situation inside the Rakhine state, where the Rohingya originate, is not assured, and the Myanmar military is known for its very brutal crackdowns, and the UN called it ethnic cleansing or even genocide that was happening for the last several months. So pushing them back voluntarily or involuntarily, I don't think it's a solution. Jess, you are a specialist in humanitarian issues. It looks like the two states, the host state Bangladesh and the sending country Myanmar, seem to be working up a solution that really will not work for the people on the ground. It seems like an imposition, but where will they go? Where there's no place on earth, it seems, for these for the wretched of this region.
Yeah, so I think it's important not to overstate the significance of these 5 Rohingya that have recently been apparently repatriated, as led by the government of Myanmar. Both the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in Bangladesh and the government of Bangladesh have both said they had nothing to do with this repatriation. And of course, while repatriation is one of the durable solutions of the United Nations for refugee situations, it has to be voluntary, it has to be sustainable, and it has to be managed with dignity, and there is no evidence at the moment that with this particular instance that is the case. That being said, there has been an agreement between the government of Bangladesh and the government of Myanmar to look at this as a solution in the medium term, but there hasn't been much movement on it so far.
Yes, yes. In fact, the international conventions and the standards you are citing seem to be blatantly disregarded in this case right from the start. The Myanmar military is impervious to any outside pressure, it seems. So even though there has been tremendous coverage in the media internationally criticizing the actions of the Myanmar military, and also casting doubt about the integrity of no less a figure than Aung San Suu Kyi, it seems like they don't really care, and whatever pressure or sanctions or external advice has come to them has fallen on deaf ears. So the question really is, I mean, just to cite an example, in April the UN has blacklisted the Myanmar military as one of those entities that is responsible for committing grave sexual violence against innocent civilians, and they have done that on a systematic basis against the Rohingya. And still it looks like the collective moral outrage is not really doing much in terms of changing the situation. So on one hand you have a nascent or a very small militant movement emerging within the Rohingya community in the name of self-defense against the Myanmar military, and on the other hand you have this international community that is insisting that Myanmar should respect international conventions, and the state is saying, look, we have a terrorist problem and that's our main problem, and really we don't see these as natives of Myanmar. They lack citizenship. What can we do about basic civil rights for this kind of groups when they are stateless and caught between, as I said, the devil and the deep sea? And Bangladesh is has been generous to host them, but only briefly. So what kind of, is there any light at the end of the tunnel of this story?
I think without doubt it's going to be a continuing crisis and a protracted crisis, and I think again it's important not to overstate the amount of international pressure the international community have put on the government of Myanmar.
They could do more, you're saying?
Absolutely, absolutely. They could do more, and there is a general reticence to invoke some of the political commitments of recent decades, such as the responsibility to protect, for example, to invoke that, naturally launch a significant action. I think in terms of future prospects, there are a number of, for repatriation to be successful, there are a number of conditions that must be met in Myanmar, and they are looking increasingly unlikely. It is not secure for Rohingya to return. This isn't the first wave of violence that has led to a mass outflux and then a repatriation. This is the third in, I think, about 2.5 decades. An Amnesty International report from recent days has shown that although Myanmar government are speaking about repatriation, what they are actually doing in the areas that Rohingya have fled from is they are bulldozing them and they are building military bases. So what hope of a life the Rohingya have if they do go back is very questionable. So there isn't a solution on the short term.
Yes, yes. In fact, I think as a political scientist, this makes me wonder about the nature of the state and the regime in Myanmar, because ultimately that is the fountainhead of this whole problem, because they have been fanning the flames of this Buddhist fundamentalism for narrow political gains, and Aung San Suu Kyi's hands seem to be completely tied, and she really has no option. And I think, to be fair to her, for all the international criticism, she's thinking about the democratic transition that is supposed to happen from military to civilian rule, and she has got a small sliver of hope only, and the military still controls most of the levers. So for her to now take a moral stand on this issue probably will not change anything. And secondly, I think she believes that the larger transition to democracy, which impacts on all of people of Myanmar and the entire society, may be disrupted, and we may go back to full-scale military dictatorship. So military rule generally is bad, is quite abusive around the world, and just I think democratization of Myanmar may be ultimately, and maybe a federal solution with autonomy for different minority groups is, I think, the only ideal solution that we must keep on talking about.
Yes, but I think that is ideal and not anywhere on the horizon. I mean, the internal domestic politics in Myanmar is incredibly complex. There's a range of different ethnic groups and conflicts ongoing within the state. And I think that whilst there has been praise recently about the democratization of Myanmar, it's still very limited. The military still have a significant influence, and I don't think we can hope for what you have outlined anytime soon.
Yes, indeed a very bleak picture, and we will hope that there is some significant change. India must play a bigger role in finding a political solution to this problem, and we would also want SAARC as well as ASEAN, the two countries with overlapping membership, because Bangladesh is in SAARC and ASEAN has Myanmar as a core member. We need to work for inter-regional solutions really, and think about more creative ways of resolving this. Okay, moving on from the Rohingya issue, let's head to Latin America, where you could not have imagined a Cuba without a Castro. 1959, the Cuban Revolution happened, and Fidel Castro ruled with an iron grip for several decades, and then transferred power to his brother Raul Castro. But this week, Raul Castro is also stepping down as president, and we are likely to have, for the first time ever, a non-Castro, but from within the Communist Party of Cuba, in charge. So how big of a change is this? Let's listen to this report first.
On April 19, Raul Castro is stepping down as president of Cuba, and a successor will be appointed. This is the first time in 60 years when a non-Castro will be ruling Cuba. However, Raul Castro retains powers over the Communist Party and the military. Economic reforms and relations with the USA are the top priorities for the post-Castro Cuba. Can the Communist Party maintain its iron grip on Cuba even after the charisma and control of the Castros fades away? Is Cuba's transition to democracy impossible? What can regional organizations in Latin America do to help improve the lives of Cuban people?
So, big questions we have asked. Castros, dominated the scene for so long, and their personal ability to keep the society together through a mix of repression as well as ideology was really legendary. As you know, during the Cold War period, the United States tried to assassinate Fidel Castro, and there were several attempts to overthrow the regime, but it has survived even after the Soviet Union collapsed. One of their main patrons, Moscow, no longer supported them, and then later Venezuela started providing massive oil aid and other assistance to the Castros to continue. But now it seems like they have reached an end where neither Venezuela is in a big crisis, and there is no Soviet Union to back them anymore. So they are in a corner, and the question is, can this new leadership after the Castros bring about some kind of meaningful change? I want to tell viewers that there are only 4 existing countries in the world which are ruled by communist parties: China, Vietnam, Laos, and Cuba. North Korea is sometimes classified as a communist country, but frankly it's a personal dictatorship, it's a dynastic rule. But here you have like a proper party infrastructure in a country like Cuba, and it dominates most of the levers of policy making and social sphere. So just making a transition within a communist system towards greater reforms, is that asking for too much, especially when the successor is handpicked by Raul Castro himself?
I think that's an interesting question. I think we need to address that over various terms: the short term and the medium term. I think in the short term, there's unlikely to be significant change. I mean, it's only recently that Cuba has started opening up economically, anyway. And in terms of Raul Castro stepping down, he will still be head of the Communist Party. He will still remain head of the military, and of course, this is a significant power within Cuba. So the extent to which there is a full power transfer is contentious. Nonetheless, I think this does signal a further change in what is a process of more medium-term and long-term economic and social change in Cuba.
Yes, and I want to share with viewers my own view that Cuba has reached a kind of a saturation point with this model of heroic anti-imperialism, because they have done that during the Castro's era, and there was a legitimate reason for it. As I said, there were many attempts. The CIA was trying to assassinate Fidel Castro, and many in India sympathized with Cuba as the underdog that was standing up to the American giant. But now we have a stage where, you know, the Trump administration is trying to bring back pressure on Cuba, but is nowhere close to the earlier eras when there were all kinds of plots and conspiracies to destabilize Cuba. So to keep on talking about the American threat and how that is the reason for the economic decline or the stagnation, I think is a bit of a cop-out. You know, what they need really is somebody like a Deng Xiaoping. जैसे माओ जेडोंग की मौत हुई 1976 में, और उसके बाद से एक रिफॉर्म का दौर चला, काफ़ी बदलाव लाए गए चीन में डेंग शियाओपिंग द्वारा, और जिसकी वजह से आज अभी तक सत्ता में कायम है चीन की मार्क्सवादी कम्युनिस्ट पार्टी. लेकिन सवाल यह है कि can the Cuban Communist Party also make this transition? Will the successor to Castro be able to actually, you know, bring about reforms? One of the problems, Jess, is you know, the military in Cuba, which has been behind the Castros and supporting the regime, is supposed to be controlling approximately 60% of the economy. So they don't want to let go of the levers of this is the political economy of this dictatorship that we talk about in Cuba, where you don't see big changes because the entrenched state apparatus backed by the military has cornered most of the benefits. So even though it is a communist country in name, there are inequalities. Relatively speaking, in Latin America, you know, Cuba has made some progress on health and education, and it has some successes. But still, the issue is tight control of the military, very less private enterprise, and that too, you know, with kind of a close monitoring of dissidents and political prisoners. So it doesn't look. It looks like, you know, without the Castros, will the Communist Party be able to manage this, or will there be an uprising? You know, and that's something that, you know, people have been talking about for a long time. Hasn't happened. The regime still has important pockets of legitimacy. But if you look back as a historian, communist parties, when they, you know, are overthrown or when they move towards democracy, clearly it's going to be a big struggle.
You're exactly right, and I think this might be the opening of the floodgates. I mean, you're seeing a lot of kind of popular disaffection now, actually, with or disappointment with the market reforms, and that they haven't achieved as much as was promised. And although you've seen an increase, for example, in private self-employed enterprises, I think there's over 500,000 now in Cuba. It's quite it's benefiting a very small minority, and private businesses are still finding it incredibly difficult to operate. So I think there's perhaps it's significant expectations on the new leaders' shoulders, and the extent to which they can maneuver within those current structures that you just explained will determine the reaction from the population and the future of the Communist Party in Cuba.
Yes, yes. In fact, I want to share with viewers an interesting statistic. The average GDP growth rate that Cuba has been eking out since Raul Castro started a few reforms about 7 to 8 years ago is just 2%. On the other hand, the communist government itself says they need 7 to 8% of growth in order for the economy to develop, to lift people out of poverty, especially the farming sector. And they want more tourism, they want more American dollars to come in, but the Trump administration has taken a very hostile line and is reversing the liberalization that started under Barack Obama. So given that, you know, Trump is hardly into his second year, it looks like the hostility from the US will continue, and they will try to tighten the screws on Cuba. And unfortunately, in return, you will see this anti-imperialist rhetoric, the same old thing, which unfortunately doesn't really uplift the people of Cuba. So the question is, from a point of view of the people of Cuba, this seems like a cosmetic transformation, the handover of power. Raul Castro is still going to wield a lot of levers. So we'll have to see how much of a change comes out of this, both in Cuba's foreign policy, especially towards the US, but also the domestic economic policy. That's all we have for this week in terms of time. We have been discussing a variety of issues, but I'd like you to all to think about these in a deeper sense. हमने आज 3 मुद्दे उठाए, भारत और ब्रिटेन, उसके बाद रोहिंग्या की समस्या, और आखिर में क्यूबा में जो बदलाव हो रहे हैं, राजनीतिक बदलाव. इन तीनों को अगर आप एक साथ लेकर देखें तो कोई रिश्ता नहीं है. There is no relationship between these three. But if there is one common thread which is running, which is there are intractable problems for which solutions are very, very difficult. But there is an ideal scenario out there. We would want idealistic change. We want you to never give up your dreams and aspirations for making the world a better place. But it's a hard nut to crack. So we need to keep on thinking. And I think the deeper we delve into the issues, the better chance we have of solving these problems. And that's the whole purpose of Foreign Pulse, to stoke your curiosity, to make you go deeper into these issues. So keep thinking and keep brainstorming how we can transform the world into a better place. Thank you, Jessica, for joining me today on the show. Thank you, viewers.